What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh. We got Jay's Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, John Morant's, Joe Johnson's. No, we're not John Morant's. Sorry. We have Jays for Days podcast, Jay's Jumpers, Jaron Jackson Jr.'s, Joe Johnson's. Do we have to take Ja Raff out? That's still like a sick name for a
Yes,
giraffe.
and I think Ja Raff is fine.
I think Ja Raff is fine. I think whoever came up with that name for the baby giraffe in the Memphis Zoo, for those of you who don't know who Ja Raff is, I feel like that's still a feat of creativity that we need to rule.
Yeah.
And Jimmy Butler's.
Yeah.
We've got Jimmy Butler's too, because that dude is carrying this Heat team that's starting Kevin Love in 2023 all the way to the NBA Finals, and it makes about 0 sense. The only thing I could come up with is that Eric Spoelstra is the Eric Spoelstra Jimmy Butler like duo, like coach and best player duo is just like undefeated. That's the only thing I could come up with. But anybody who is expecting a Lakers Celtics NBA Finals, those chances are effectively over. You hear the fire like that? That's the truck going to set to put out the fire that's happening in the Boston Celtics building right now. That's what you were just hearing. But we do not have that other Jay currently. We do have Jimmy Butler's. Josh, how are you?
Yeah, I'm ready for the finals.
See,
We've seen what we need to see.
See, I was doing post PGA Championship stuff yesterday, and by the time I got to okay, now I could like watch some of this game, it was over. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, I don't need to watch this.
Yeah.
It's a little unfortunate.
We've learned what we need to learn from for the conference finals. We got two teams that deserve to be playing in the finals. Let's just make it happen.
Dude, we don't need game 4. We don't need game 4. Not an NBA podcast. Used to be an NBA podcast. You've been around long enough where this was partly an NBA podcast. You've been around for a considerable amount of time, but only a college basketball podcast. However, this is about as close as to an NBA podcast as we're going to get.
This next month.
The next month. Because I don't know if you know, Josh, but every year all the teams get together and draft players coming out of college and other and just seemingly out of the abyss to play for their NBA franchise the following year, or at least play for an adjacent farm league franchise. And they do that every June, late in June. And about a week ago, we had the NBA draft lottery. The Spurs win the Victor Wembanyama sweepstakes. What a crazy thing that would be if the Spurs just pick somebody else. It happens every year. That's whoever wins the lottery. It's like, okay, that team's going to get Zion. And we start talking about how, the Pelicans win the Zion Williamson sweepstakes. Like, Victor Wembanyama is not a Spur yet. He's going to be a Spur. But what if the Spurs were just like, actually, we like Scoot Henderson more. We're going to take Scoot and absolutely shock the world. But you would have thought that Victor Wembanyama actually became a San Antonio Spur last week. That is not actually the case yet. He will be soon, at the end of June, but not quite yet. I just think that's funny how we didn't even start with soon to be Spur. It's just the Spurs get Victor Wembanyama. Like that's what we're talking about. And
that's how ESPN was treating it, which surprised me. There was no qualifiers because some of the actual headlines I saw for web stories was earn the right to select Victor Wembanyama, which makes sense.
Which makes
right. That's the whole point. They won the lottery. That means they can get this guy.
Right.
ESPN just how you feeling about San Antonio, Wemby?
Right. Exactly. and then reporting things like Tim Duncan will work with new Spur Victor Wembanyama. I was like, okay, when they draft him, when he becomes a part of that team. And this kind of leads into, so real quick, what we're going to do today is we're basically just opening up the Pandora's box of the NBA draft on this podcast, getting into the draft season, and we'll do some mock draft stuff. We'll do some draft superlatives and kind of look at, right, as Zach Edey and other decisions are made, we'll of course address those as well. But this is more than anything, Josh, I think an intro into this year's NBA draft as we kind of shift the podcast in that direction for the next month or so. And so what we're going to do on this pod is like I got wonderings about the draft. I don't do a ton of NBA draft thinking before about this time. And so as a result, I don't come in as a guy who's really been paying attention for the last 12 months at the prospects. I know of them and of teams' situations and teams that needed, good draft lottery positioning, but this is where we kind of get into the area of actually looking into this draft. So that's kind of what we're going to do today in the form of just lottery adjacent questions about the 2023 NBA draft. And the first one I have, Josh. So we've each got roughly 5. I'm sure there will be a little bit of overlap, but the first one kind of gets to the point that we're getting at here, is that it's just a foregone conclusion that the Spurs are going to take Victor Wembanyama. And like Victor Wembanyama will go number 1 overall. The question I have is there even a price for the number 1 overall pick? Is there anything that any team can do, right? You look at these teams that have unbelievable draft capital right now, whether it's, New Orleans still has quite a bit of draft capital. Of course, Oklahoma City is going to make like a third of the lottery picks in the next 10 years.
Oh, please put him next to Chet.
So,
that would be amazing.
Well, you likely, right, if they do make a trade like that, Chet is going to go to San Antonio.
Trade the rest of them. Just keep Chet.
So, right, so like hypothetically, a Chet Holmgren and all of our first-round picks for the next decade kind of thing. Is there even a price for Victor Wembanyama? I kind of think the answer is no, but I'm curious because if there is a number 1 overall pick that is worth trading the type of capital that Phoenix gave up for Kevin Durant, it's probably something like this. But I'm still not sure, right? Even draft picks like Victor Wembanyama have more value before they're actually drafted, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's probably even more expensive than it might be a year into Victor Wembanyama's career. But it's an interesting question to me. And if we even get any sort of rumors about what a team tried to pony up to move into that number 1 spot,
there's a price, and it starts with a franchise-altering superstar, which is basically the problem here.
Right.
I'm not trading this pick for a guy who hasn't played an NBA game.
Right.
I'm not trading this for a bunch of... obviously you got to have the draft picks too. I'm not trading it for a bunch of draft picks. And, Mikal Bridges. Not because Mikal Bridges is a bad NBA player, but because Mikal Bridges is not the best player on a championship team.
No.
So if the, Nuggets to lose in the NBA Finals and decide they need to... Now, this is never going to happen.
No, Jokic, you're right. You know what? We're done.
Right. Then yes. Okay, now we're talking,
That would break the world.
Yeah, the new coach in Milwaukee.
If the Nuggets traded Jokic for Wembanyama.
I guess so. Maybe you're talking Joel Embiid, and even then, you got to have a conversation.
Sure.
Because here is the one. I guess I have my kind of 2 things about Wembanyama. One, and I saw John Hollinger make this point. It's a good one. Do you know how many people his size? I think it's over 7'3", have played 1,000 games in the NBA?
Not many.
0.
See, that's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, that's true, but there's also like 12 guys that fit into that category.
The sample size isn't huge, and he's not built like those other guys.
Right.
And he's coming into the NBA in a age where, the medical attention is better, the research is better in terms of stress management and those kind of things. He's set up to take care of his body better. His game lends itself to not being destroyed in the post. That is part of this, though, is that... And now, look, if you get him for 10 years and then it kind of all falls apart, is it worth it? Probably.
Mm-hmm.
unless he doesn't end up being what he's supposed to be. And I just have a hard time believing he's going to, unless it's injuries, he's going to fall way short of expectations. He's a taller, more skilled version of Kevin Durant. Now, he's not the shooter, but...
Or the ball handler. I mean, he's not the productive ball handler of Kevin Durant. Victor Wembanyama does a lot of things with the ball that don't actually get him anything. He likes to dribble between his legs in front of a defender and prove that he can do it.
Yes.
Kevin Durant is the more productive ball handler. Sure. 100%.
Sure. That's a fair way to categorize it. Just that part of it. And then the second part is Wembanyama is not Tim Duncan or Tony Parker in terms of personality. This guy's going to...
What do you mean?
He's already on the verge of being a global superstar, right?
Sure.
This dude hasn't even played an NBA game yet. The idea of him being in San Antonio... Now, he seems very happy that San Antonio got the first pick. I am very interested what the... And it could just be simply, look, I know, right, the international pedigree there, Tony Parker, Boris Diaw, you can go down the list. It might be as simple as that.
Tiago Splitter.
Yes. Right, we got
Manu. Jeez, we have to say Manu.
I was going for the French guys in particular.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right, fine.
Yes, right. International pedigree, French pedigree in particular. This dude is just, from a brand standpoint, he is too big for San Antonio, if this works. Not necessarily that that's going to be a problem. And it's a very good sign that he seemed happy that they are the ones landing him. It's just interesting to me that kind of how this is all going to go and how he's going to mesh with, right, like you said, dribbling in front of people just to show that he can dribble in front of people and make them look silly. Is that something you associate with Greg Popovich?
Right.
You know, it's going to be interesting.
The thing that's the most intriguing for me with Wembanyama is this is not the same position that Tim Duncan walked into when he was the number 1 overall pick for the Spurs.
Mm-hmm.
Not even close. The Spurs had 8 winning seasons in a row, 5 winning seasons in a row. I think it was starting in 93 or so, all the way through the year before Duncan got drafted, and they had injuries. They won like 50 games, then won 22, then immediately won 50 again.
Because who did they get with the first overall pick in franchise history?
Yeah, David Robinson.
Exactly.
And so Duncan got to walk into a room where he didn't have to be the guy.
Mm-hmm.
Victor isn't even a Spur yet, and he's already the guy in the building. So, and I don't really have a sweeping declaration to say about that when it comes to whether or not Victor Wembanyama is capable of rising to that level of expectation. It's just different. Because at the same time, Tim Duncan also walked into a building that was expecting to win championships immediately. Victor Wembanyama is also not expected to do that. I mean, I think there's a belief that he will put them on that kind of track, but I don't think anybody in the building is expecting him to win a championship before 2026, right? And Duncan was entering a room that was kind of already in that position. So, but it is not, the lineage is obvious of big men who were number 1 overall draft picks in San Antonio, but it's not like Victor is stepping into the same kind of situation that Duncan was, because he was in a very unique spot for a number 1 overall draft pick to be in. It doesn't happen all that often. It's much close. He was much closer to what happened to, say, James Wiseman with the Warriors, a team that clearly was not the second worst team in the NBA. But Steph Curry broke his hand and Klay was out with an Achilles injury, and then you get a bad record and a good draft pick. So I'm very curious about that, because it's been 40 years, 30 years, 35 years since a guy walked into the Spurs building as the number 1 overall pick and was immediately the guy, because Tim Duncan doesn't fit that bill. He became that guy, but David Robinson was still the guy when he walked into that building.
Right. And also just a veteran star to say, here's how this is going to work. Right. Not just a veteran, but a guy that can then set the stage to eventually hand that torch to Tim Duncan.
Right.
Yeah. You don't see that very often.
Now, perhaps the second best thing to having that guy as your teammate is the Spurs just going to Tim Duncan and saying, hey, what do you want per year to come be Victor Wembanyama's personal trainer?
Right.
Like, what do you want? We'll give it to you, because that's about as close to the scenario that Duncan walked into as you can get. Mm-hmm. And if I'm a Spurs fan, I'm a really big fan of that. But it'll be very interesting early on, because I'm already a little exhausted by the he's injury prone thing. Like, he is injury prone as a 7'5" human being, but it's not like anybody who had that pick at number 1 would pick somebody else because of that. So I don't understand why it's such a massive talking point. If you were actually considering not taking him number 1 overall because of those issues, then we can have a conversation about that. But nobody is actually going to do that. It just feels like, and not to call your point lazy, because that's not what I'm doing. It just feels like a lazy thing to talk about when it comes to Wembanyama, because everything else seems so bulletproof. Yeah. From the way people talk about him as a prospect and the type of game that he has for the current NBA. Everything else, there's nothing controversial to talk about other than he might get injured. So I think that's what people default to. But to your point, 7'5" guys typically don't have long careers, right? The last number 1 overall pick like this, in terms of just sheer size, was Yao, and Yao was good until he wasn't, and then it ended very, very quickly.
And you weren't getting 82 games a season out of him. Which
I'm not going to act like I remember how many games Yao was going to play was playing per season, but I'm guessing you're right.
I'm fairly confident. I can look that up in a minute. Yeah, I kind of just made that assumption, I will admit. I think, one, it's exactly like you said, that's the reason why people are pointing to it, is because there's nothing else to point to. Mm-hmm. 2, the counter I would have is...
Okay, we have to go to the defense of Yao Ming.
Oh, okay. I apologize, yeah.
So he played 5 games in the 2010-11 season, the year after he injured his foot and didn't play the whole season, and that was kind of the end of his career. 2005 to 2008, he played 57, 48, 55 games, okay? But his first 3 seasons, 02-03 to 04-05, 82, 82, 80.
Oh, okay.
And then the year before he got hurt, 77 games. That is alarming how fast his NBA career ended. He played 77 games. He started 77 games, played 33 minutes per game, and averaged 19 points and 10 rebounds and 2 blocks. In 2008-09, once that season ended, he played 5 more NBA games in his career. That is alarming. And I don't know if he returned to China and played any there. I'm guessing he didn't. But wow, that's
so
pretty
we're talking
alarming.
Essentially 4 full seasons.
Yeah, he was in it, and he was four full seasons. He was an all-star. Don't tell me he was an all-star the year he played 5 games. I refuse to believe that. There's a little star next to his name though, to the year. Hall of Famer and 8-time all-star. He played 8 years. He was an 8-time all-star. How about that?
There you go.
It's an impressive. Hall of Famer, played 8 seasons. Hall of Famer, no MVPs, no finals appearances. Hall of Famer. I mean, I'm in. I'm very pro Hall of Fame as the story of an organization's lifespan, and I feel like you can't I don't think you can tell the NBA story without Yao Ming. Anyways, go ahead.
So you got four full seasons. Now, yes, 3 of them were consecutive at the beginning, right? It wasn't just kind of, sometimes there were injuries along the way. It was that you weren't, especially after the first 3 seasons, believing you could get a season out of him, you know?
Sure.
Now, again, is Wembanyama Yao Ming? No. The pushback I would have would be that I agree with your general sentiment that you can't blow it out of proportion because anybody would be taking that quote-unquote risk. 100%. The reality that we have not seen this before, though, maybe we need to pump the brakes on this is the greatest prospect in the history of pro sports thing.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you could have a guy that has a note that guarantees he would never get injured ever, and we would still need to pump the brakes on the greatest prospect ever thing.
That would be my only pushback.
That's fine. You can push back on other people. I'm not the one sitting here saying that he's the greatest prospect of all time.
Right. We're on the same page in both regards. That you got to look at something to explain why this might go wrong, because there's nothing in his game to suggest it. So you say the injury part of it, and then you go, well, yeah, absolutely, you're going to take that risk. And I just as you're getting tired with the injury stuff, I'm also getting tired with this is the greatest prospect we've ever seen. Because fundamentally, if you've never seen somebody deliver at this size the way that you have to be the best prospect ever and live up to that, we need to calm down a little bit.
Here's my hot-ish take. And here's the thing that I believe. This is what I think is going to unlock longevity and a really special career for Wembanyama. And then we can move on to other questions, because believe it or not, we do have some other ones. The first is so Yao Ming is 310 pounds.
Yeah.
Victor Wembanyama is 225, 230, depending on where you look. So there are 2 ways to look at this. And I'm concerned about one of the ways, because I think him staying as slim as possible is part of the reason that he would be able to achieve longevity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Like as long as you put, I don't need Victor Wembanyama to turn into a ground and pound interior presence on either end of the floor. That's why, for me, Detroit was so intriguing, is because they already have the big guys to put next to Victor Wembanyama to do all of those things.
Yeah.
And I don't need him to come in and gain 15 pounds of muscle. I don't. And Kevin Durant has proven that you can be about that big around and have a very successful NBA career.
And now look at what Kevin Durant looks like from a physical standpoint.
Right. I think they're trying to make Victor Wembanyama into something he's not if he steps into the building and they immediately try to add 20 pounds to him.
Mm-hmm.
Because I still think that Anthony Davis putting all the muscle on that he did is part of the reason that he can't stay healthy ever. The mid 2010s version of Anthony Davis was just as dominant as the current one is, and was 20 pounds lighter and didn't have nearly as many injury issues. And allowing Victor to do what he's good at, which is be a guard in a 7'5" body, which is a ridiculous sentence. It will be unlocked if you put a guy next to him like Rob Williams, like a semi-versatile big man who can take all of those most physical defensive assignments and then kind of just stay out of the way offensively. And I just think it's pretty clear that that's not what he is, and I hope that teams that the Spurs don't try to turn him into that, because I think that would help with his longevity if you just maximize the body that he has now rather than trying to add 20 pounds to it for the sake of physicality, because that's just not what his game is. He's a dance around you, use my skills kind of guy, and I'm 7'5", so good luck trying to stop me. And on defense, he's a weak side, like, oh my gosh, he came out of nowhere and blocked that shot kind of guy, rather than the guy bumping with Joel Embiid in the post.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways,
yeah, and that's the counter to the injury argument. He doesn't do what other guys his size in the NBA have been brought in to do. So don't make him into something that has not gotten you the longevity that you're hoping to get out of him as the face of your franchise. Embrace all the things he can do that all these other guys can't.
Yeah.
Right there with you.
Okay, let's move on to things other than Victor Wembanyama. Where do you want to start? I'll let you pick, and we'll kind of go from there.
Let's just move down one.
Victor slide. was one of my questions. Victor was I had a Victor question which we've satisfied.
Yes.
And then I had a question about the price of the number 1 overall pick. So which I already offered to you. Mm-hmm. So we have satisfied 2 of my questions.
Okay.
So I'll let you start somewhere, and we should be in a similar spot.
Yeah. So this is number 2 for me then.
Sure.
Yeah. Let's go down and just talk about one pick later. What is the Hornets' thought process here?
Certainly.
And to me, there's 2 parts to this. One, do you care at all that the best player available on the board doesn't necessarily mesh all that well with LaMelo? 2, if the answer to that question is yes, how do you make sure you're not paying a price basically for the way your roster is constructed? And what I mean by that is the same thing we were talking about with the Pistons and Cade when there were all these rumors circulating they wanted Jalen Green. That's fine, but you can't take him 1.
Mm-hmm.
Because somebody else is going to value, in that case Cade Cunningham, in this case Scoot Henderson, as the second best prospect in this draft class.
Mm-hmm.
Which means they need to be paying you to draft Scoot if you don't want to. How do you make that happen? Because to me, you have failed from a process standpoint if you take anybody other than Scoot number 2. Because somebody will. Unless...
okay, sorry. I agree with that. Sorry. My bad. At first, I just thought you meant that you're wrong if you want Brandon Miller over Scoot, but that's not what you said. You said not drafting Scoot number 2, which is inherently means you could draft Brandon Miller number 3.
Right, exactly. Right. If I have to, and maybe this changes by the time we actually get to the draft, I have to believe there are enough teams that would pay a price to get Scoot that you can put yourself in a position, and maybe you can't get Brandon Miller then. Especially because we're going to get to pick 3 in a little while here. It's kind of a weird situation there. But I have to think there's somebody, if you decide you're not taking Scoot, to me, your next job is to work the phones and get whatever you can for that pick. Unless there's just nobody that's going to keep you high enough where you're happy in terms of the pick that you're getting in return. Because to me, there is, and maybe it's not a consensus number 2, but there's a number 2 prospect that enough people agree about that player needs to be going number 2 unless you get incredibly unlucky in terms of the offers you're getting if you're Charlotte.
I'm going to turn that around on you. Because I think if Portland stays at 3, Brandon Miller makes a ton of sense for the Portland Trailblazers, along with what they already have on their roster. From Shaedon Sharpe to Anthony Simons to Damian Lillard. There's a lot of backcourt scoring and stuff already going on there. If I'm Charlotte, I like the first move I might be making is trying to convince Portland that I want Brandon Miller. And if you get no kind of tapping you on the shoulder, calling you late at night kind of thing, then maybe Portland just wants Scoot. And if you actually just want Scoot, then you just end up taking Scoot. But if Portland really wants Brandon Miller, and you can convince Portland that you're going to take Brandon Miller, if they don't move up to 2, then maybe you can do a switcheroo and add some draft capital later with a Portland team that is with a Portland team that might suck not that long from now, right? Like that's certainly a possibility. So I completely agree with the sentiment that if you don't want Scoot, if you just want Scoot, and you're not all that worried about a bottom tier Western Conference team when you're the Charlotte Hornets, then just take Scoot and let Portland take Brandon Miller. That's fine. But I think it's worth, playing the field a little bit and seeing if you can get Portland to bite on moving up to make sure that they get Brandon Miller.
Yep.
And it's really interesting though, because I think, and I personally don't think there's as big of a gap between Scoot and Brandon, certainly as there used to be. And there are even guys like Kevin O'Connor at the Ringer who have Brandon Miller higher on his big board than Scoot Henderson. Mm-hmm. So it's not even like, and I say that to say, there are some years where it would be ludicrous for you to try and convince somebody that you want this guy instead of this guy, right? It's like, that guy's obviously the number 2 overall pick. You're lying to me. I think there's enough conversation about Scoot versus Brandon Miller that those kind of rumors can be believable. But I absolutely agree with your sentiment there, and it's interesting because neither team obviously now I just think that whether you're picking second or third, whoever's still on the board at 3, you take, because that's clearly the third best, the best guy left on the board. And if you're picking at 3, you probably don't have the luxury of drafting for fit. But I absolutely agree that there's some gamesmanship to be had by the Charlotte Hornets at 2.
Yeah, and that's the other way. Basically, you just have to make sure you don't lose your leverage here. And you got to maximize your leverage, right? If Portland looks at it and goes, we don't really have a use for Scoot, we can't afford to have that be the player that falls to us because it's just going to make things messy, then you can leverage it the other way because they are close. I think there's enough of a general agreement that Scoot is 2.
I would agree with that, yes.
And at the same time, if you can't get somebody in the top 3, top 5 to bite, then that's where my perspective changes. If you're getting offered pick 10, is the gap between Scoot and Brandon Miller, if you prefer Miller, worth moving down 8 spots? To me, the answer is probably no, unless you get an awfully good package around that number 10 pick.
Here's the other thing. What if Portland is more interested in finding a guy that can help Damian Lillard win right now?
Yeah.
Because Damian Lillard has earned the right that as long as he's in Portland is doing whatever they can do to try and win. Right. And I've had this conversation with multiple people about, but do you really kind of put your future at stake for a now in his mid-30s Damian Lillard? The answer is yes, because Damian Lillard has earned that respect, I think, at least from my vantage point. And if I was running the Portland Trailblazers, that's just what I would be doing.
Or trade him.
Right. Or but if he wants to be there, then Damian Lillard has earned the right to have his organization try to find a way to win. Yeah. And like, there's an argument that I'm willing to have, or a conversation I'm willing to have, that maybe Brandon Miller is the best way to do that, right? The Anthony Simons takes another step, so you kind of have this Anthony Dame Lillard backcourt thing. Then you have your Brandon Miller two-way wing, because if he's a hit immediately, then there aren't a ton of guys. There are guys, but is there really a guy that you can get from like the team that's drafting 7th that's going to be better than that potentially successful Brandon Miller? That there's at least a conversation to be had there. But that's the other part of this 2-3 and who might end up making those selections, is because Portland might just decide that the best way to further their chances of winning games with Damian Lillard to put number 3 on the chopping block and see what they can get in terms of proven NBA commodities.
Yeah, that's my third thing, is the Brandon Miller factor here. Does somebody convince themselves to take him 2? And then, like you just said, are the Blazers actually willing to hold on to this pick? Because I'm operating under the assumption they don't want to. For the exact reason you laid out, that generally speaking, rookies are not the best way to immediately improve your team. So if that's the case, and you have to at least imagine that the Blazers are going to be willing to have conversations about this pick, the other part of this is, what team is willing to move up, hypothetically, specifically to get Brandon Miller, with everything that's gone on? And we've covered it. He hasn't been charged with a crime. He's talking to NBA teams. You know, you're at least getting some perspective from him directly on what happened. There just is part of this that you are voluntarily giving up draft picks to intentionally go get this particular player, right?
Right.
And the storylines that come with that. It just sets up a very weird situation because, yeah, this team at 3 is not trying to be here. In a 3-player draft where team 2 doesn't necessarily mesh with the second best player available on most people's boards, but it's not like there's an easy solution here because Portland's probably looking at all these guys going, this isn't our best path to getting where we want to be, which is competitive for Dame.
Right. And then you kind of look at the other teams in the lottery, and let's run through a couple of them real quick. So Houston, because the other part of this is right. It's not just like you have to have a guy that we can get from you that helps us win immediately.
Right.
So keep that in mind as we go down this list. Houston. Is there a guy on Houston's roster right now that you're sure would be better than Brandon Miller tomorrow? No. Detroit. Is there a guy that they're going to be willing to give up that you're sure is better?
No. Important qualifier, but no.
Right, because they're not going to give up Cade, and they're not going to give up Jaden Ivey, and Jalen Duren probably doesn't move the needle enough in the way that Brandon Miller could potentially move the needle. Right, it's all about potential, but in theory, Brandon Miller can knock down 43% of his threes and guard the best player on the other team. Orlando is interesting, but Orlando has all kinds of wings. And like they're not going to give you Franz Wagner. They're not going to give you Paolo Banchero. Probably the most likely scenario there is them giving you, I mean, right, you probably want 6 and 11 from them, because that's the other part. And this is my number 3 here, is which teams are most likely to move around. Portland is one of them. And Orlando, just because of the fact that they have two top 11 picks. But I mean, the most likely player to go back in a transaction like that would probably be Jonathan Isaac, which Jonathan Isaac could be an all NBA level defender if he could just stay on the floor. Right. And that hasn't happened in a really long time. So would you do that even if you do get 6 and 11 in a draft that we'll get to momentarily, because I have thoughts about that as well, is pretty thin, pretty fast after 3. Indiana doesn't have a player that you think is going to be better than Brandon Miller.
Tyrese Haliburton.
Yeah, but they're not trading Tyrese Haliburton.
Right.
I mean, the only other option would be, okay, Indiana, we want 7 and Benedict Mathurin. That's probably the only way that works. The only way that goes, and that's probably they're not going to do that.
The Wizards do.
The Wizards have a guy in Bradley Beal. Now, but also granted, are you going to pay 2 guys in their mid-30s in a couple of years, $60 million each? $60 million each. Remember when 2 max guys were like getting $60 million total? Like both of them were getting 30.
Yeah.
So this is interesting because, right, Portland, it's not like we're not moving from 3. We want Brandon Miller. That's how this is going to go. But at the same time, you got to go pretty deep. And there's not an obvious, because that's the issue with trying to move around for impact players now with other teams in the lottery. They're in the lottery for a reason, Josh.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And there aren't that many players that would move the needle in the right direction for Portland that are actually on teams that are in a position to move up to 3. So
yeah, I'm thinking more.
It's very intriguing.
I'm thinking more along the lines of teams outside the lottery. For example,
sure. Like
Minnesota, Chicago.
Minnesota does not have a pick in the first round, just by the way.
Yeah. I would assume that's the Gobert trade.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be retired by the time Minnesota has another first round pick.
Yeah.
For Rudy Gobert, by the way. Rudy, like Rudy Gobert.
You know, can you get the Timberwolves interested in a Karl Anthony Towns conversation, for example?
If you want to.
Now, there are other questions about whether that's in your right. Does that help you, make you more competitive? Does that improve your team? Does that improve your chances of winning a championship? How much should Portland care about the second of those questions? There's a whole different conversation to be had there. But just as throwing it out there in terms of the kind of player I was thinking about with this, because you're right. To me, the moving around draft picks and negotiating with teams in the lottery is not really going to get Portland where they want to be.
And I'm not sure getting one guy and losing all of their abilities to get any other talent is going to get them that much further either. That
very fair.
They're just in a tough spot. If you get to pick in the 11th spot still, and you get a guy, right? Then in theory you're adding 2. Mm-hmm. You're still adding a lottery talent and in theory a proven NBA commodity.
Yes.
But the point being, and the point that you just made, is they're not actually that close, which is why this is weird. Right. It's not like this is a Portland team that stumbled into the 3 pick when really they just need to refine the edges to really put themselves into a strong spot as a contender. This is all just about their star having earned the right to be on good basketball teams if he wants to be in Portland. And you know, if he had played enough games last year, Dame might have been like, he had a first team NBA caliber season last year. So it's not like when healthy, he is still absolutely a spectacular talent. So, but as you said, there's pretty much everything else about Portland is uninspiring. So it's not like it's just one move that really has to be made.
Yeah, it's a tough spot.
The other team that falls into my right, which teams are most likely to trade out of where they are now is Orlando for a couple reasons. Right, 6 and 11, they have 2 of the top 11 picks. Again, shouts to Chicago. Which I think, like, at one point this season, you thought, man, the Magic might pick twice in the top 7. And then Chicago kind of turned it around in the back half of their season and almost beat the now going to the NBA Finals Miami Heat in a winner-take-all elimination game, by the way. Which is a crazy thing to say. The other part of this is, and it's kind of I think the Magic and the Thunder are in similar spots. And that spot is is okay. At some point, you just got to win basketball games. And Oklahoma City is way further down the line on this than the Magic are right now. And right, the Thunder played playing games this year, and they have a first team All NBA guy on their roster. They have another guy that was injured. You hit on the drafting guys like Jalen Williams. Josh Giddey is fantastic. They're further down the line here. But it's like the process once upon a time with the Sixers. Like at some point you need to turn this multi-year project into on-court success. Mm-hmm. And the Magic have been bad for a long time now. They have undeniable talent on that roster. And right, rookie of the year guy Franz Wagner is awesome. Who am I? I mean,
Cole Anthony, Markelle Fultz.
Thank you. Sure, just keep naming them all. So we're to the point with the Magic where if you make a couple of the right moves this offseason, you are a team that has aspirations of making the playoffs, and you just need to win basketball games at some point. So I say that to say Orlando just taking 2 rookies at 6 and 11 in a not great draft, and they could or could not contribute to the team next year. We're past that point with Orlando. Paolo being as good as he is, we've officially pushed past that point. So whether that means trading 6 and 11 for 3, whether that means trading 6 for some sort of other NBA commodity, whether it's trading 6 and 11 for an even better NBA commodity, I think it's a little bit right. It's not exactly like the Warriors thing when they had 7 and they had 7 and 14 a couple years ago when they drafted Kuminga and I think it was Moody,
yeah,
in the same. And it was okay. This Warriors team, they are right there. What are they going to do with these picks? They ended up just drafting both. You don't have Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green. You're not going to contend with the roster that the Magic currently have, and maybe they think all of those guys take a big step, and they already have enough on their roster to make a playoff push. I would probably tend to agree, but I just I'm not sure, even if that is the case, that you should just draft 2 guys at 6 and 11.
And don't play to make the playoffs. Play to build a contender. You've got pieces.
Sure.
You need more of them. To your point, can you get those pieces at 6 and 11 as opposed to trading them for something else? Yeah.
All right, we've now satisfied 4 of my 5 questions.
This might be...
Are you 3 of 5? Where are you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, get on my level and give me your 4.
To me, this might be one of the most interesting parts of all of this leading up to draft night. What do the Rockets and Pistons do? What are they thinking? The Pistons had the worst record in the NBA. The Rockets had the same record as the Spurs. They all had equal chances of winning the lottery. The Spurs get 1. The Rockets and Pistons aren't even in the top 3 in a 3-player draft. Not only that, if you look at these 2 teams in particular, they are at least on their way to building something good. You can debate how far along in the process they are, but the Rockets now have multiple top picks. The Pistons have a core of guys who there's reason to be excited about. If you get one, kind of the same thing with the Magic, right? If you get that one more piece that you go, oh, that's another franchise cornerstone. Now you're onto something. You're maybe have the ability to go acquire a high-profile player via trade or land one in free agency or something, especially if you're Houston, right? That's an appealing place to live. If you've got enough that you can go, oh, there's enough here that if I come, this is a really good basketball team. Mm-hmm. Can you get that piece at 4 or 5? And how do you deal with the fact that you just lost the lottery?
The Spurs are equally the reason, are just as much the reason why that tanking is a viable option, and the Houston and Detroit are just as equally the reasons why you shouldn't always put all of your eggs in that basket. Right.
And in fairness to the Pistons, I mean, they were trying. They just lost Cade for the year.
Right. But then they lost Cade, and then they turned, and I saw someone tweet, I watched the Pistons win 15 games this year for the 5th overall pick. Are you kidding me?
Exactly.
So it is a risky proposition, and why tanking for Wembanyama is always a risk. Now, Detroit is in a fine spot because they still have a very what I would describe as a promising core of young players, but it would certainly be different if Victor Wembanyama was on his way to Detroit.
Yeah, just how do you deal with it?
I think it's good. I think it's a very good question, and kind of leaves everybody outside of the top 3 in limbo, which is kind of what my fifth question here is. Does anybody care about the 4th through 10th picks? Like, is anybody right? Because sometimes you get teams trading up because they're enamored with a guy that they really, really want. Is there anybody outside of the top 3 that a team feels so strongly about that anybody's going to trade up to get? And that's I asked that question basically getting at the point of I haven't been as uninspired by a group of draftees outside of the top 3 the way that I am this year in quite a while. I like part of it's because, like, quite frankly, I couldn't care less what you look like in the Overtime Elite League. Like, that's like just like I don't care what anybody else looks like. The only thing I'm taking from AAU stuff is, okay, what kind of bag do you have? Like, what kind of on-ball creativity do you have, and how athletic are you? That's about it. Because everything else, I'm not all that interested in. The same can be said for Overtime Elite. The Thompson twins have certainly they have the intangibles, the athleticism, the two-way potential kind of thing that you'd want from high-level recruits or prospects, but they also nobody is blown away by their offensive ability in a league that's basically made for you to blow people away with your offensive abilities. Anthony Black is the number 6 overall prospect at the Ringer, and his description is basically glue guy. And then you get to Taylor Hendricks and Jarris Walker. I like Cam Whitmore a lot. There's just not that many guys that I am. I guess the secret is that the number 11 pick in the draft almost never does. So somebody will pop out of that group that we're not expecting, a la Donovan Mitchell. But I'm curious about the value of the rest of the lottery picks outside of the top 3. Mm-hmm. Does anybody care? Because there's just a lot of guys here, and part of this is because, I mean, before the season, Keontae George and Nick Smith were like lock top 6 guys. They're both going to be fighting to get drafted in the lottery.
Yeah,
I mean, back into the lottery at the best. So some of the horses of this draft class, if you will, before this basketball season started, didn't quite live up to. But, like, you know, Jet Howard and Jalen Hood-Schifino are 22 and 23. It's an interesting class, and I'll be very intrigued to see what kind of value picks 4 through 14, I guess specifically, are given in this year's draft, because there's just nobody jumping off the page for me.
And Cam Whitmore's injury didn't help with that either.
Correct.
Now, he certainly helped his stock once he started playing. But there are kind of some questions about, how much stock do you put in that? It seems there are kind of some mixed opinions, because I've also seen him as the number 4 prospect in the class. That if you can't get one of the 3 guys, you might as well take the the chance with him because of what he showed you and what he has physically. Even if
he's a little Shaden Sharpie, not from this
right.
He's this class's Shaden Sharp.
Yeah.
Like when you look at the next 6 guys on the big board, he probably has the highest ceiling, but it comes with we haven't seen this guy play very much basketball. And when you've got athleticism on your quick notes and you've already had some pretty like serious injury stuff, then that can always be a concern.
Yeah.
But he's also awesome.
Right. And you compare that to last year where Keegan Murray went 4, right?
Keegan Murray went 4, yes.
And what do we come out of that saying? Okay, maybe the ceiling isn't incredibly high, but that dude's going to go get you buckets right away. And what did he do? Went and got you buckets right away. Helped a very successful team this year, right? Was an important piece.
And then played in the playoff series. And then played in the playoff series. Yep.
Right. Not the best player on the team, not an all-star, but a valuable piece that's going to be part of their team moving forward.
Right.
And I was all over Jalen Williams, who the Thunder got at what, 13, 14?
Something like that.
And granted, I haven't done the deep dive on finding my guy this year yet, but yeah, there just aren't. You just don't feel, particularly Keegan Murray. You just knew exactly what you were getting, and you don't. It's a good point that you don't necessarily feel that way. Now, to a certain extent, you feel that way about Anthony Black, except for what you're getting from Anthony Black is not buckets,
right?
Which limits the ability to contribute right away. And will always come with a concern as valuable as I think Anthony Black's skill set is.
Yeah, he has shades of Lonzo Ball, which if he becomes a Lonzo Ball-esque guy, great. Lonzo Ball does a lot of really good things for a good basketball team. And hopefully we get to see him do things like that again. Lonzo Ball's career might be over, and if that's true, that's really, really sad. But I also just don't like 6 is a little better, but if you told the Lakers that they're getting the Lonzo Ball that they ended up with when they drafted him at 2, would they still draft him at 2?
Right. He's a good NBA player.
But they probably wouldn't draft him at 2.
Exactly.
And that might be the best way to illustrate the point that I'm trying to make.
Yes.
All right, I'm out of questions. Do you have one more?
Yeah, my last one is fairly simple.
Sure.
What's up, Mavericks?
What's up, Mavericks? Sure.
Okay, congratulations. You avoided the humiliation of losing your pick this year. How are you going to use it? To continue the conversation we just had, is there anybody you can get at 10 that's going to help you win? If not, what are you going to do with this pick that you have to maximize because you were so determined to make sure you didn't lose it? What are you getting out of it? And the fact that they do have this, how does that change their approach to the offseason and the whole Kyrie situation? I don't necessarily have an answer or more in-depth thoughts than that. Just this idea of this was such a big deal that they got to keep this pick. So now you have to show why it's such a big deal you got to keep this pick. And I don't see a clear way. Now, maybe Kyrie wants out and there's nothing you can do anyway. Who knows? But similar to the Blazers, you are not focused on building a team. You are focused on setting Luka up for success immediately and trying to keep Luka in your franchise. Because you haven't done a lot of winning with him. Generally speaking. Right, they were 38. I mean, they were under 500 this season. 6 games under 500.
They also went to the West Finals last year.
Yes, they have had some playoff success.
I think your point is correct, though.
How are you going to get the pieces that you need to not just win a playoff series or two, not just make a surprise run to the West Finals, but actually get to that series and feel like you can win it? Right. Now, the 10th pick is not supposed to do that by itself, but you got all this going on. You're trying to figure out what this team is going to look like. You got this pick you wanted so badly. What does this end up looking like?
And all with the underline, because the biggest difference between the Mavericks and Portland is that Portland has a star that over and over again has shown that he wants to stay there. The Mavericks are on the freaking clock,
right?
Because as the current trajectory has Luka asking his way out of Dallas way sooner than Dallas fans would like, and so you have to do whatever whether that, right, you have to hit on the pick or trade it or whatever, but you got to do something because that dude is less and less happy by the day.
Yep.
Got anything else?
I do not believe so. We'll be.
I think I'm out too.
Draft decisions, draft superlatives, mock draft, all coming in the weeks leading up to. What is it? Is it exactly a month from today? 22nd?
It's usually a Thursday, so I would guess it's the
Thursday.
2023 NBA draft.
22nd.
Wow, look at this guy.
Look
at this guy. But yes, NBA draft, the focus for the next 4 weeks or so. And we'll be back for the next installment of the Jays for Days podcast next week. Until then, please subscribe to the Jays for Days podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Follow us on Twitter at Jays for Days Pod, and check out the YouTube as well. Thank you so much for listening to this edition of the Jays for Days podcast. I'm Josh. He's Josh, and we will see